All right, everybody. This is actually pretty big news when it comes to Bitcoin. The Czech National Bank has approved the proposal to consider adding Bitcoin and other asset investments to its central bank holdings. Holy cow, this is pretty big news. In the last 5 years of Bitcoin, we've had some pretty big moments, right? Obviously, Michael Saylor entering into Bitcoin was a pretty big moment via his company MicroStrategy, right? Obviously, that's done very well from him. And that is still early. Even though MicroStrategy got into Bitcoin back in August of 2020, it is still early to corporate adoption for Bitcoin. A couple years later, or let's say actually less than a year later, was El Salvador, which I'm currently in right now, beautiful El Salvador, that adopted Bitcoin. And it's still very early for El Salvador and for nation state adoption as a whole. And now we've had the ETF, now we've had SAB 121 repealed, and now we have this new massive piece of news. The board of the Czech National Bank has approved a proposal today to analyze the options for investing in additional asset classes, including Bitcoin. This is incredible. It was only yesterday that this consideration was shared via Reuters that the bank was looking into doing this. Comes down to some key people that have been in the bank in the last couple of years that are looking to allocate up to 5% of the bank's holdings, which is about $140 billion, into Bitcoin. This is a significant announcement. Now, other people are not as thrilled about this, right? Obviously, Christine Lagarde is, the chair of the ECB. And of course, she is not nearly as thrilled about this, right? Very recently, she was saying she was confident that reserves will not enter the Bitcoins will not enter the reserves of any of the central banks of the general group council of the European Union, blah, 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 right? Obviously, so there are haters out there that are not wanting this to happen, right? Obviously, including the people that have online incentive to not promote it, right? Christine Lagarde says she had, quote unquote, a good conversation with the Czech colleague. However, nonetheless, they are announcing the proposal to investigate the integrating of it. Right now, has this happened yet? Obviously, it has not. Obviously, they've not yet bought Bitcoin. But I want to go through why I think this is a big deal for game theory wise, and also, of course, what this means for Bitcoin price. So, as the articles that you can read online alone say, the National Bank is aiming to invest at least 5% of its $140 billion of euros into Bitcoin. Okay, again, there are concerns from finance ministers, from Christine Lagarde, and from other people. Again, volatility seems to be the large concern. As I always say, we've less in common with the future in the past. Volatility still remains as one of the big narratives against Bitcoin. However, pretty soon, like Michael Saylor is championing, that is eventually going to be perceived as a positive. As people begin to change their perception from risk and volatility being bad to volatility being good in the face of a volatile political currency, pretty soon that volatility that's a massive headwind is going to become a massive tailwind. So let's talk about what those tailwinds might look like in terms of dollars. 5% of a $140 billion euro treasury is about $146 billion USD if you're going to go with current exchange rates for euros and US dollars, and you're going with their current balance sheet, and you're assuming the current percentage they're shared. Now, I would assume if they're saying at least 5%, while there is maybe a 10% chance this goes through, there was also, let's say, some non-zero chance that we're looking at a larger allocation, right? Maybe we're looking at a 10% or 20% chance, right? There's always a chance that this doesn't go through, but there's always a chance that it goes through higher, right? So for not assuming either way to the optimistic or the pessimistic side, let's just assume this is a what if. What if they put 5% of $146 billion into Bitcoin? That would be $7.3 billion USD. Now, this would be significantly smaller than what Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy have done over the course of the last 5 years. However, it is a much larger purchase, a much larger acquisition than what El Salvador has done. El Salvador has amassed over 6,000 Bitcoins. This would be a move roughly 10 times larger than what El Salvador has been able to accomplish in the last 3 years. This is a massive implication. So $7.5 billion is a very small number in the grand scheme of things, right? America sends $7 billion in foreign aid, every couple of weeks or whatever it is, right? We send money, we spend that much money out of wazoo, right? We spend it like at a crazy rate. Now, of course, if they were to buy Bitcoin, it would not be at the current price. The current price right now at the time of recording is about $105,000 in Bitcoin. Obviously, if they were just to go out there and smash buy $7.3 billion worth of Bitcoin, obviously it's going to force the nominal price upwards, right? That's just inherent, right? So let's take the assumption they get an average of $140,000 per Bitcoin, right? Again, let's use MicroStrategy or MicroStrategy as an example because they are a comparable example here, right? MicroStrategy's cost basis now is upwards of $60,000, even though when they started buying in August of 2020, we weren't even looking at a $20,000 Bitcoin. So I think even this is exceedingly optimistic. First, we have to assume they actually approve the 5% allocation, right? That's the first thing we have to assume. The second thing we have to assume is that the euro retains its purchasing power against the dollar over that period of time. The third thing we would have to assume is they deploy all that 5% into Bitcoin. And the fourth thing we have to assume is that they only force the Bitcoin price up 40%, or in other words, the Bitcoin price only goes up 40% over the course of their buying, which I think is exceedingly optimistic in favor of the central bank. With those assumptions, we would be looking at 52,142 Bitcoin on the balance sheet of the Czech central bank. That is what we'd be looking at as a bullish, optimistic scenario, right? Of course, like I said earlier, like a moment ago, there's always a chance that they buy more than 5%, right? Obviously, there is a non-zero chance that they could, be buying more than 5% on the balance sheet. That's always a possibility. However, if we're just stating with what's being said and the most optimistic scenario with, probably the best realistic price they could potentially get, we are still looking at a Bitcoin balance barely 50,000 Bitcoin. That is, I think, something of major significance. That even if everything that they're saying they might do, they actually do, they're not going to get 100,000 coins, right? They're probably going to get way less than 50,000 coins. But let's take the assumption. Let's say they get 50,000 Bitcoin. Where are we going from here? Well, the Czech Republic has 7.95 million people, just shy of 8 million people live in the Czech Republic. How many Bitcoin is that per person? Well, if the Czech Republic follows these assumptions and they convert 5% of their balance sheet fully to Bitcoin at an average price of $140,000 a Bitcoin for each one of their citizens, that is approximately 650,000 Satoshis per person. 650,000 Satoshis per person, right? Of course, they're not going to have a whole Bitcoin, right? That's far away and too far gone, right? They're not going to get 10 million Satoshis per person, right? That's too far gone, right? They're not going to get 1 million Satoshis a person. That's too far gone. We're going to be looking at less than 1 million, some amount less than 1 million. That we can say with confidence. Maybe they won't get 650,000 sats as citizens. Maybe they'll only get 300,000. Maybe they'll get 400,000, 200,000, 900,000, right? Maybe they'll get close to 1 million, but they're probably not ever going to have 1 million Satoshis per person on their balance sheet. That is really important. Right now, you can buy that. You can buy that amount of Bitcoin for, what would that be? That would be about $700, more or less. You can buy that much Bitcoin for less than $1,000. Now, $700 is a lot of money to a lot of people, right? I'm well aware of that. Right here in El Salvador, especially in developing countries, $700 is a lot of money, right? Don't get me wrong. Like, that's a lot of money to a lot of people. However, if we're thinking about a multi-decade time horizon where this thing could potentially go, $700 or 650,000 sats, which is perhaps one of the best case scenarios for one of the first adopting central banks for a country. Like, keep in mind, my point in this is not saying that, oh, you need 650,000 sats to get rich. My point is saying that this is the beginning of a trend. Don't focus on the data point, focus on the trend. This is the most optimistic scenario for the first central bank looking to acquire Bitcoin. It only gets more absurd from here. You may feel like 600,000 Satoshis is not that much money. You may feel like $700 worth of Bitcoin is not that much money. I'm telling you, that is probably the best case scenario that a central bank is ever going to get for any of its citizens. The Czech Republic is a relatively small country with not even 8 million people. Of course, also that means that its balance sheet is smaller than other countries like, say, the US or, other even European countries, right? But my point largely remains the same. 650,000 sats a person that a central bank is ever going to be able to stack is probably on the higher end of optimism. It's probably too conservative. But nonetheless, let's push forward with that assumption. If you have 6 million Satoshis, 0.06 Bitcoin, that is potentially 10 lifetimes worth of sats. And if you don't believe me, keep in mind, the median person in the future is only going to have 50,000 sats or less, right? There are 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis in the world. There are 8.5 billion people in the world today. And of course, the next couple decades, there are going to be over 10 billion people. If you do the math and you assume a typical Pareto distribution, the median person, not the bottom, the median person, the person right in the middle, 4 billion people richer than them, 4 billion people poorer than them. The median person is probably going to have between 50 to 100,000 Satoshis. Probably not a lot less than 50, definitely not much more than 100, or actually definitely not even 100. But my point is, that is the median person in the future. And the average person in the future is going to have more purchasing power than the average person in the past, right? Like myself, I'm a relatively average person for a, Western country, a developed country, right? But yet I still have way more purchasing power than most billionaires had decades ago, or especially a century ago, right? And so this is my larger point. 50,000 sats is a significant amount of time if you're thinking about your kids' lifetimes, or you're thinking about your grandkids, which if you're holding Bitcoin, that is the timeline you should be thinking. For those of you saying, oh, I'd have to wait too long, okay, fine. Then your time horizon is too short. For me personally, I'm in Bitcoin for my kids, my grandkids. You should be in Bitcoin for your future, your retirement, your kids, and your grandkids. You should not be in Bitcoin for the next couple of years. This is so important to emphasize. I'm being as conservative as I can. We are only assuming $140,000 for an average price. We're assuming the maximum Bitcoin stack they probably could get with this allocation. And they may not even approve this allocation, right? Christine Lagarde could totally shut this down. They could totally shut that down. This could totally not go through. And actually, if it doesn't go through, that is more bullish for Bitcoin price, because even if we're as bearish as possible, we assume they get all this in, they get that 5% allocation, they get it at relatively cheap Bitcoin prices. That is still a Satoshi number over 10 times higher than the number of sats the median person is going to get. And this amount is not going to help the Czech people keep up. It is going to supercharge them ahead. In the future, their citizens are going to look back and say, oh my gosh, it was so smart that they put 5% of their balance sheet into Bitcoin back before it was $10 million a coin, because they got our average citizen over 10 times the number of Satoshis that the median person is ever going to have in the planet, right? Just from that one allocation they made. So my point is, even if we ignore the math showing that most people will never have 100,000 Satoshis, let's take the number of the average person that's going to be ahead of the world's population, 650,000 Satoshis, or let's round down to 600,000 sats, right? Again, let's go back to our numbers. Again, this number already is increased by a factor of 10, because we're looking at 600,000, not 50,000. Okay, actually 12x, not a 10x. If you have 6 million sats, 6% of a Bitcoin, that's 10 times more Bitcoin than the average person in the Czech Republic is going to have if the central bank meets all these assumptions. If you have 0.6 of a Bitcoin, right? 60% of a Bitcoin, 60 million Satoshis, that is 100 times more than the average Czech person, who is going to be way ahead by a factor of 10, the average median person in the future, who is going to be way ahead and having more purchasing power than the average person today. I don't think you are bullish enough. If you have 6 Bitcoin, you have 1,000 times more than the average person in the Czech Republic is going to have, even if they get this through. If you have 60 Bitcoin, you have 10,000 times more. If you have 600 Bitcoin, you have 100,000 times more. Now, I know maybe 1 or 2 of you watching this video have hundreds of Bitcoin. Probably dozens of you have 60 Bitcoin. Probably at least 100 or a couple hundred of you have 6 Bitcoin. And probably the rest of you are somewhere in between the 6 million sats and 60 million sats point. But my point is, it doesn't matter if you're watching this video with the net worth in the 8 figures or the 7 figures or the 6 figures or the 5 figures or even the 4 figures, right? My point is, actually, it doesn't really matter. Like, if you have 100,000 times more Bitcoin than a wealthy person in the future, or if you only have 10 times the amount of Bitcoin of a wealthy person in the future, right? Okay, you can retire for your entire lifetime one way. You can retire for your entire lifetime the other way, right? All of these amounts are significant amounts of Bitcoin. Even 6 million Satoshis is a significant amount of Bitcoin. I've been saying that for a long period of time, and this should be your wake-up call as to why it is true. Central banks are coming to Bitcoin. And the same way that MicroStrategy and the corporate companies are coming to Bitcoin, the Czech Republic right now has an opportunity to be the MicroStrategy of central banks. And this is the very beginning of it, right? Like, look at MicroStrategy. No other company ever is going to be able to compete with MicroStrategy? None of them. MicroStrategy is 10 times more Bitcoin than the second largest holder of Bitcoin, right? Like, it's not even a competition. And probably at some point in Bitcoin's adoption, there is going to be a central bank that has its MicroStrategy moment, that becomes the central bank that per capita, per its citizens, has 10 times more Bitcoin than the central bank that is in the number 2 spot, right? Like, that is my larger point in making here. What if this actually goes through? What if the Czech Republic manages to acquire 600,000 sats per person? I wouldn't be surprised if the second best central bank has 60,000 sats a person, right? Because keep in mind, most people in the future aren't even going to have 60,000 sats. So probably most central banks in the future are not even going to have 10,000 sats per citizen, because the other 40 to 50,000 sats are going to be held up in other kinds of, other kinds of wealth, right? So my point is, what if the Czech Republic becomes the MicroStrategy for central banks? And even if that's the case, you're still looking at intergenerational wealth, orders of magnitude, multiple orders of magnitude more than the average wealthy person is going to have. I do not think you are bullish enough on Bitcoin. I don't think you realize how much money 600,000 Satoshis is. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And I would highly encourage you to begin protecting that money as soon as possible. There are two things I'm going to share as we wrap up this video. The first thing I want to share, the more urgent thing I want to share, is this. Okay, a Bitcoin is going to be worth millions of dollars. Okay, it's going to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Okay, right now is the most expensive year in your lifetime. Your number one risk is not maximizing the opportunity cost that's right in front of you. You need to increase your Bitcoin stack as much as possible. Okay, I get some complaints of people from, people that are becoming clients, already clients, people that watch my videos. The number one complaint is like, oh, Luke, you're too expensive, blah, blah, blah. Nobody ever complains, I worked with Luke and then I lost my Bitcoin. I worked with Luke and then I had a tax hit I wasn't expecting. I worked with Luke and this and that, the other, right? My goal, my job is to help people increase their Bitcoin stack. That's good for me because it helps me make more money, helps me keep people happy. But that is the most effective way for you to prepare for the next few years and decades. Stack as much Bitcoin as possible. What's the best way to stack more Bitcoin? Is to increase your education, increase your conviction, lower your risk, increase your risk tolerance to buying Bitcoin. The more you lower your risk with your self-custody setup, the greater the incentive you have to begin and continue buying more Bitcoin. My average client increases their Bitcoin stack by 51.2% within the first 12 months. Let's say any given year, you have a 1.5% chance of dying, okay? You have a 40% estate tax for your kids. Plus, let's say 4 times out of 5, your wife and kids get all your Bitcoin back, but we have to think in probabilities, not in absolutes. And we have to admit there's a 20% chance your wife and kids have all the Bitcoin stolen from them on the event of your passing. Okay. If you just plug in the percentages, if you assume 19 times out of 20, you do literally everything perfect forever and you never make a single mistake with your Bitcoin self-custody. Let's assume 19 times out of 20, you're just fine, and that doesn't happen. Okay. That's a 5% chance of user error or theft, right? Let's assume 97% of the chance, 97% of the time, you manage your taxes effectively and you don't get hit with a big tax bill, right? Okay, that's a 3% risk. Okay, let's say 99 times out of 100, you don't get sued for all of your Bitcoin, some percentage of your Bitcoin, half your Bitcoin, a tenth of your Bitcoin, whatever it is, right? And let's assume 199 times out of 200, nobody $5 rent tax you. Now, I think that's ridiculous, especially if you have $1 million or $10 million or $100 million worth of Bitcoin. $5 rent attack is a way higher percentage probability to you. But my point is, we have to think of probabilities, not absolutes. And the same way with the Czech Republic, we have to think of probabilities. What if they buy Bitcoin? What if they actually do it? What if they actually get a cheap price for Bitcoin? If. There are a lot of variables here. And the same thing is true, not just with the external world of the central banks that you can't control. It's especially true within the world you can control. These are things right now you can control. There is some non-zero percentage chance you are going to lose Bitcoin due to user error or theft. There is some non-zero chance that you're going to die in the next year. There's some non-zero chance you get a $5 wrench, a lawsuit risk, or some sort. There's always risk. Nothing is free. And just because you haven't gone through these things yourselves yet, it doesn't mean they aren't going to happen. But your biggest risk of all, like I said, is opportunity cost. It's not even the risk of losing your Bitcoin. It's the risk of not optimizing and maximizing your ability to stack more Bitcoin. So this is exactly what my encouragement is. If you have 4